Every year in the early 2000s, my parents would send me to Poland for the summer. I would spend the first week at my best friend's/old neighbor's house, and then her dad would bring us both to my grandparents' farm where we would spend the rest of the summer. My cousins and their parents would also stay there a lot throughout the weeks. Most days it was my grandparents, great-grandmother, 5 cousins, aunt, uncle, and myself along with my friend who lived in the house. Since there were so many people staying there with limited space, my 2 cousins, friend, and I decided it would be best if we camped out in the garden right outside the back room. The room had a patio right off its glass door, giving us easy access into the house. The summer was going like any other. The 4 of us were having a blast hanging out late at night around the town. We had full freedom as nobody really cared what time we came back to our tent. The village my grandparents lived in was very secluded, with houses spread apart and fields of corn and other crops growing between them. It was incredibly dark, and many nights we would lie in the street looking at the stars. One night, there were fewer people in the house, and my friend and 1 cousin were in the back room off the garden watching a movie, while my other cousin and I were hanging out in our tent. At one point, we heard footsteps circling our tent. We were so scared and decided to stay quiet and still. Finally, we heard the door handle of the glass door leading into the back room rattling. My friend and cousin must not have heard it, but my cousin and I decided to peek out. All we saw was a dark figure with a lit cigarette walking away from the door and leaving the property. We were so freaked out, we decided to all spend the night in the house. It wasn't until later that we found out there was a man who had escaped a mental hospital a few towns over. He had been there for raping and killing his sister. To this day, we still have no idea who the person was that came by that night, or what their intentions were. We're just thankful that nothing more happened that night. Even over 20 years later, I think about that night and what could have happened. You may have seen my boyfriend's story about the mushroom tunnels, but I have my own unique story. It all started when I was about 9 years old. At the time, I attended a small Christian school with fewer than 100 students across 10-year levels. For our annual school camp, years 4 to 6 went to Barrie Sport and Recreation Center for 2 nights. I was excited but nervous. This was 4 hours from home, and I had never been away from my mom without an older relative. Thankfully, my sister, just a year older than me, was also attending. When we arrived and unpacked, I felt an unfamiliar sensation in my chest. After lunch, we socialized with students from other schools. That evening, after dinner and night games, we returned to our cabins, which were more secluded than the other students' accommodations. All the girls in my cabin talked about how the place felt eerie. When the lights went out, I saw a tall shadow in the doorway. Terrified, I moved to another girl's bed in the next section. I eventually fell asleep, until I woke to a woman's voice calling for Max and Luke, reassuring them it was safe to come home. I barely slept after that. The next night, we left our cabin tidy before heading to the gym for night games. When we returned, everything was trashed. Items thrown around, lights on, nothing as we left it. Suddenly, screams rang out, "Demon! It's a demon!" followed by crying. Teachers rushed in to console us. No one slept that night. On the bus ride home, I was filled with fear and curiosity. What had we encountered? Even weeks later, I felt uneasy. Then, small things started happening at home. A door rattling with no draft, footsteps when no one was awake. Soon it escalated. My family, believers and skeptics alike, witnessed unexplainable events. We heard children running up and down the stairs, and twice a clock jumped off the wall at my mother. My guitar strummed itself. But the worst part? Whatever it was, it focused on me. My bedroom was downstairs near the front door. I heard tapping on my windows, scratching on the walls, footsteps on the gravel outside, where no one could have been. Banging on the front door would wake me in the middle of the night. But the sleep paralysis was the worst. I woke between 3 to 4 a.m. every night, unable to move, often feeling a presence sitting on my bed. One morning, I found my door unlocked and wide open, though I hadn't touched it. At 11 we moved. Everything seemed fine, at first. But in our new home, strange things continued. My sister's bathroom was connected to my room. I would see one of them enter, but never leave. I heard the shower run, but no one was there. When I asked, they said they hadn't even been in the room. After moving again, all activity stopped. Years later, curiosity led me to research Barrie Sport and Rec. What I found was shocking. It had once been a home for misbehaved boys where they were beaten, some possibly to death. My cabin? It had been the punishment room. Others who visited reported similar terrifying experiences. I still wonder why I formed an attachment and what it wanted from me. but it explains my lifelong fascination with the paranormal. I was 14 and my two cousins, M and S, were 13 and 9 at the time. I am 32 now. I grew up in West Virginia in the middle of the mountains in the middle of nowhere. My cousins would be dropped off for the summer and spring break at our grandpa's house, which was next door to me. So I got to see them quite often. We would climb the mountains and go for walks up the road. We would walk to what we called the first new house. Basically, someone new had built a house a mile from where I lived, and it had been a while since most homes there were much older. Anyway, there was a mile that was just open with no homes or anything within that stretch. One day we decided to go for a walk and we noticed a white van parked on the side of the road near the creek, but no people. We walked by it and I told my cousins to stay near me because it felt unusual. We walked on to the first new house, then turned around to head back home and the van was still there. But this time 2 men were sitting in the van, staring at us and not looking away. They just looked at us coldly. I whispered to my oldest cousin to grab us and run. We took off running and they started chasing us in the van. Finally, we came across the neighbor's yard, which had a creek right before the yard. I told them to jump, threw my little cousin S down the hill into the creek and I kept running. Luckily, my dad was standing on our bridge when I got there. I was freaking out and told him that the 2 men were trying to get us into the van. As I was telling my dad, the van drove by, and the 2 men gave me a stare that I can only describe as evil. Their eyes held no emotion. My cousins were fine. S had cuts from some briars because I threw her over the hill. I didn't jump because I had a bad knee and knew I wouldn't be able to run anymore if I jumped. So, I took my chances of my knee giving out by continuing down the road rather than knowing I wouldn't be able to get up if I jumped down the hill. We never saw that van again. We noticed the license plate was covered, and there were no windows except the ones in the front. I knew they had bad intentions. Luckily, we were all fine. This isn't my story, but instead my grandma's story. She told me this story a little while ago after I asked her what was one of the creepiest things that's ever happened to her. This happened to her over 8 years ago at one of our local malls. It was around early December that month and early evening when my grandma had gone to the mall. She'd gone to the mall to do some early Christmas shopping that year for my family and some of her friends. She was at Macy's in the men's clothing section when it happened. My grandma was looking for some polos and pants when she noticed something out of her peripheral vision. She looks to see what it is and sees that it's a man staring back at her. She describes the man to be somewhere in his mid to late 40s. My grandma, being the kind soul she is, just looks at him, gives him a brief smile and goes back to looking at the clothes. She eventually leaves the area and goes to the men's fragrance department to look at different colognes. While she was checking out the fragrances, she once again notices someone in her peripheral vision, but they're standing still this time. She looks to see who it is and it's the same guy from earlier. She glances at the guy and sees that he's just looking at her with a blank, emotionless expression on his face. My grandma isn't a paranoid person and just chalks the whole thing up as one major coincidence. She stays in the fragrance department for another 10 minutes and then heads to the women's section. After being in the women's clothing section for about 15 minutes, she heads over to the women's fragrance department. She's skimming through the different fragrances when she catches a glimpse of someone on the other side of the counter. She looks up out of curiosity to see it's the same exact guy again. My grandma could see the same blank stare he was giving her as he made his way over to the same side of the counter she was at. She watched as he came over to her side but stood about 20 yards away from her. My grandma decides to leave Macy's shortly after and head inside the mall to visit the other stores. She goes to the first few stores with no incident, but when she makes her way to the 4th store, that's when she notices it. She turns around to see the same creep from Macy's following her. A pit had begun to form in her stomach as she realized that this guy was bad news and very likely had ill intentions towards her. She goes in the 4th store, which thankfully the guy didn't enter, but she was a bit on edge because of it. This went on for a while every time my grandma went to a different store, as the creep followed her but always kept his distance. My grandma eventually made her way to the bottom floor of the mall. That's when she decided that she needed to find a way to get away from this man. She was looking around to see if anyone would help her until she spotted a security guard not too far ahead. She went up to him, explained her current situation, and asked him to see if he could escort her back to her car. The security guard agreed and escorted her out of the mall and back to her car. The creep saw that my grandma was talking to security and stood there, not going any further. While they were walking through the mall, the guy still followed them, but at a much farther distance than he previously did. During their walk through the mall, the security guy explained to her how my grandma did the right thing and how very lucky she was that day. My grandma questioned him, and the guy explained to her that apparently some lady had been stalked through the mall and was abducted shortly after a few months ago. Security went on to explain they never found the woman and have yet to find the person who abducted her. It wasn't until my grandma and security were almost at the exit that the creep lost interest and walked the opposite way where he was going. My grandma thanked the man, and the man watched her get to her car and leave the parking lot safely to make sure she wasn't followed. My grandma is forever thankful for security being around that day, as she firmly believes it was her guardian angel protecting her. She also believes that if it wasn't for that guy who helped her, she could have been abducted and forced into a human trafficking operation and would have likely never been seen again. My grandma didn't return to that mall for a very long time after that out of fear. She goes to that mall occasionally, but only when she's either with my mom, her friends, or with me for her own safety. If these stories send a chill down your spine, make sure to subscribe to the channel for more terrifying tales. You never know when the next horror story might be your own.